Greetings and salutations and welcome back to Colin's Last Stand right here on YouTube. My name is Colin Moriarty and today I'm wearing what I kind of feel like technically is a black shirt, but it kind of looks gray with gray pants. I was told by the man in Lucky Jeans that you don't wear gray with gray. But there's nothing I can do about it now. The film has already started, so here we are. So today I want to do a video. I think this video is going to be pretty long, but I don't really know, on something called Project Horizon. What is Project Horizon, you ask? Well, a lot of you are not going to know what Project Horizon is because it was until recently a classified mission. In fact, it was top secret until a little after it was commissioned. From 1959, the Department of Defense and the US military undertook a study to see if they can build a moon base, a lunar base, by the year 1965 and have it commissioned by 1966 with a full outfit of 12 people. And it's a really, really fascinating study. I hadn't heard about it actually until a couple of years ago. Someone had directed me toward it. And there isn't that much information out there about Project Horizon, other than the fact that both studies are declassified, so you can now look at them, and I've linked to them in the description below. And pretty much all of the information in this video is indeed based on those studies. So let's be more specific. The study was commissioned in March of 1959 by the DoD and by the military, and it was readied in June of 1959, and it was all about the feasibility on if we could do this, on if the military, with help from a bunch of different government agencies, as we'll get to in a little while, can somehow, some way, get us to the moon in a permanent way. Now think about how extraordinary that actually is. That is an extraordinary feat, considering two very important components. Number one, we did go to the moon, but we didn't go to the moon until 1969, land on it, and we only did it a handful of times. And we've not gone back since. And indeed, there's actually a third component as well, which is we don't have any sort of permanent moon base. We don't have any sort of permanent placement anywhere off of Earth, except for in the International Space Station. So what they were asking to do in the 1950s and into the 1960s was unheard of. It was extremely difficult. It was probably going to be impossible, but they looked into it nonetheless. And this project is called Project Horizon. To understand where the United States was in 1959 in terms of space travel and all of these kinds of things, we kind of have to understand where everything was in the world at that time. Not only with the United States, not only with our space program, but with our arch nemesis space program, the Soviet Union. In 1957, in late 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, which was this really rudimentary, pretty much useless satellite. But it was an artificial satellite that went into orbit around the Earth for several months before it crashed back down through the atmosphere. And it was a really big deal that the Soviets did that. And it was an even bigger deal that the Soviets did it before we did. Sputnik scared the living shit out of everybody in the West, especially in the United States. And it was looked at not only as a military and political and surveillance and espionage threat, because we didn't know what the satellite could do, but it was also something about our prestige, that these communists that we looked at as frankly degenerate and frankly backwards were able to beat us to space. And it wouldn't be the last time they beat us there either. We launched a satellite called Explorer 1 in early 1958, which was our first satellite. And this was after we actually failed to launch a satellite in December of 1957 because we were trying to rush to match what the Soviets had already done. But by the time all of this was happening, they launched Sputnik 2, which is when they launched a fucking dog into space. The Soviets launched a dog into space. They killed the dog. They lied about it, by the way, until the early 2000s. We had no idea that they were even lying about the nature of what happened to that poor canine. They better stay away from Lola. And in January of 1959, the Soviets launched something called Luna 1, which reached the moon. It was actually supposed to kind of go into orbit around the moon, but it kind of missed. But still, it was the first body that we ever launched as a human species that left Earth's gravity well. And then Luna 2, they launched to the moon and it actually crashed into the moon. So the Soviets, for a little while, were going balls out, as it were, in terms of space exploration, space travel, being very ambitious, because they knew how political it was. They knew that it would be a propaganda win for them, and they knew that it was a way to thumb the eye of the Americans all along the way. It's worth noting that NASA was founded in 1958, the year before the study was commissioned, and they would play a role in Project Horizon, but this was primarily military-driven, as we're going to get into in a little while. So the question is why? Why were they launching something called Project Horizon? Why did they want to investigate this undoubtedly very expensive, undoubtedly very complicated, as we're going to find out, extremely complicated, even today, this would be incredibly complicated to do. And what the end goal was. Why were they looking to do something like this? I want to read verbatim some of the statements from Project Horizon's now declassified documents. to give you an idea of why we thought this was pertinent and why we thought that this was an important step for us to take. Quote, "There is a requirement for a manned military outpost on the moon. The lunar outpost is required to develop and protect potential United States interests on the moon, to develop techniques in moon-based surveillance of the Earth in space, in communications relay, and in operations on the surface of the moon, to serve as a base of exploration of the moon, for further exploration into space, and for military operations on the moon if required, and to support scientific investigations on the moon." End quote. So that's a pretty loaded statement. And what I love about this is almost the Jetsons-like awe that it fills me with, and I think fills a lot of you guys with out there as well. We didn't really understand what we were talking about at this point. We didn't know where things were going. We didn't know if the Soviets would want to make a moon base. They anticipated that they were going to. They had several plans to make their own moon base that we found out about later. But we didn't really know. Were we going to be fighting on the moon? Were we going to be fighting over the moon? Were we going to be fighting in space, in low Earth orbit? All of these questions were still open at the time, and I suppose they're still open now. But people anticipated after the detonation of the nuclear bomb and the harnessing of nuclear power beginning in 1945 that we were going to advance technologically much quicker than we were beforehand, and that was true to an extent. So these guys were really forward-thinking and forward-looking. And as we'll get into in just a second, when we talk about the base itself and the construction of the base itself, they understood that what they were suggesting was going to happen, what they were planning, was ridiculous in a sense. But more on that in a little bit. The intro also says, quote, "The primary objective is to establish the first permanent manned installation on the moon. Incidental to this mission will be the investigation of the scientific, commercial, and military potential of the moon," end quote. So that's an important statement as well, because what they're basically saying is the goal is to have a base on the moon. It's not to do X, Y, and Z. It's not to investigate science or to have a military base. We just want to be there. That's the entire point. Just to do it. Pretty bold stuff, but this is the Cold War we're talking about. Here's another statement, quote, "Because invaluable scientific, military, and political prestige will come to the nation that first establishes a lunar base, it is imperative that the United States be first," end quote. So this is a pretty big statement as well, and again feeds into that Cold War mentality, the idea that we have to be first, we have to do it for prestige, for propaganda, and to fuck the other guy, or they're going to do it. And we saw that with Sputnik versus Explorer, the two satellite programs that the Soviets and the Americans were launching. We saw that later with Luna. And of course, we ended up besting the Soviets by the time Apollo rolled around in the mid and late 60s. But this was before that. This was literally when NASA was less than a year old. And here's the biggest statement of all, in my opinion. Quote, "To be second to the Soviet Union in establishing an outpost on the moon would be disastrous to our nation's prestige and in turn to our democratic philosophy. Although it is contrary to the United States policy, the Soviet Union is establishing the first permanent base, may claim the moon or critical areas thereof for its own. Then a subsequent attempt to establish an outpost by the United States might be considered and propagandized as a hostile act. The Soviet Union propaganda broadcast has announced the 50th anniversary of the present government in 1967 will be celebrated by Soviet citizens on the moon. The National Space Policy Intelligence estimate is that the Soviets could land on the moon by 1968, end quote. It's worth noting that this is conflicted throughout the report. There are some people that are writing in the report saying that actually the Soviets could do this as soon as 1965 or 1966. But nonetheless, you get the idea. Everyone's scared of the Soviets. We got to get to the moon before the Soviets. We have to have a base before the Soviets have it there. That way we can protect the moon, because who knows what's going to happen there. This is what Project Horizon's all about and why it's so fascinating. So let's jump in. So to make sense of this report, I did my best to kind of separate it into sections. The study itself is separated into two parts over 425 total pages. Some of the pages are redundant, but most of them are not between the two. Volume 1 is called Summary and Supporting Considerations, and Volume 2 is called Technical Considerations and Plans. So I got a lot of information out of Volume 1 and some substantial information out of Volume 2. There's a ton in these volumes that I do not cover, and frankly, a lot of the stuff, especially with the launch vehicles, the space trajectory, space travel, all those kinds of things, I don't even begin to understand or pretend to understand. So if you want to read into all of those, you can. There's a lot of detailed data there. You can lose an entire night or two reading these. And so I suggest that after you watch this video, you actually jump in. Again, in the description below, you'll find the links to the direct reports and see for yourself what's going on here. So the first part I wanted to separate this into is that this would be extremely difficult. And they note that multiple times throughout the reports, that this is a huge ask. At one point, they make comparisons between Project Horizon and the Manhattan Project. For those of you out there that don't know what the Manhattan Project is, that was the years-long American endeavor, a very top-secret endeavor for us to chase, create, and use the nuclear bomb, which happened throughout World War II, really beginning in the early 40s and culminating in 1945 when we dropped an atomic bomb after testing one on both Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. So the Department of Defense and the US military, with plenty of experience, of course, with the Manhattan Project, are saying that Project Horizon needs to have the same priority and the same structure in order to get something done. It needs to be very, very important if it's going to happen at all. I found this statement interesting as well. It says, quote, "The logistic organization required to support Project Horizon will be large. In fact, larger than any single known or proposed industrial organization. This immediately leads to the conclusion that military support will be required," end quote. So what they're basically saying here is, yes, NASA exists. Yes, we have private organizations and other governmental organizations that we're going to need help from. But really, this is so fucking insane that only the military is really capable of holding this together. And in case you're curious where NASA comes in, they do say, quote, "A lunar environment exploration program on a scale considerably larger than is known to be currently planned must begin by 1962. And it is anticipated that NASA will sponsor this research activity," end quote. And you'll notice in the quote, I put the text there on the screen, NASA is not this ubiquitous term yet because it's less than a year old at this point. So they call it the NASA, as if they're old people. The NASA. I mean, that makes sense. It's the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, but we refer to it as NASA. NASA will have to do something, not the NASA. Just a little aside. All right, so next up were the goals. What were the goals of Project Horizon? Why did they really want to do this? We went into, of course, the rudimentary, this is the Cold War. We want to beat the Soviet Union. We want prestige. We want propaganda use out of this. We want to be there first. All that's valid. But why? What were the real goals? Here's what they had to say. Quote, "The very absence of knowledge about the moon and outer space is scientific justifications to attempt to breach this void of human understanding. It is expected that civilian efforts to advance science for the sake of science will parallel the military efforts. It is also expected that the National Aeronautics and Space Administration will treat those subjects in greater detail than is either possible or desirable in this study, and that such action will further strengthen the requirement for earliest possible establishment of an extraterrestrial outpost," end quote. And they also set up a series of 8 goals in Project Horizon's write-ups. And the goals are leadership, geopolitical, scientific, military, reconnaissance, surveillance, communications, and explorative implications. So these are the things that they're looking into, apart from the simple Cold War realities of us getting there first. You'll note that a lot of this conflicts with each other, actually. You can tell that a lot of cooks were in the kitchen, and in fact, if you read some of the introductory paragraphs and introductory pages to the reports, you'll see that there were a lot of people in on this. So some of these things conflict with each other. I noted before that someone had said, the Soviets will get to the moon by 1968. Someone else says in the same report, the Soviets might get to the moon by 1965 or 1966. Someone in the report says, we got to do it just to do it, right? I told you that before. That is the goal. We're just going because we need to go. But these guys are saying, well, no, these are the goals. So again, get used to that sort of conflicting kind of thing. These guys really didn't know what they were doing or talking about. They were doing their best. And a lot of very smart people wrote this report. But again, this is the great unknown they were talking about in 1959. The Department of Defense creates a timeline in Project Horizon over 6 phases about how they were going to execute all of this. And the phases were... Phase 1 is the report, 1959. So the report is what you're reading if you want to read the PDFs that I've linked to. That's as far as Project Horizon ever gets. But that is the phase 1. That is phase 1. Phase 2 is, quote, detailed development and funding plan, end quote. That will take 8 months at the cost of $5.4 million in 1959 money to be delivered by 1960. So what they're saying there is, you like Project Horizon, you like the report, you like what we've written up so far, we're going to get really into the nitty-gritty of this now. We need some money and we need some time, and we'll deliver the report next year and we'll really get this ball rolling. Phase 2's existence indicates that the rest of the phases are going to happen, and phase 3 is the biggest and meatiest phase of them all, because this is where they're going to develop hardware and integrate systems and create all the things that they need to create in order to make this lunar outpost a reality. Remember again that I gave you some insight into where we were in terms of space travel and in terms of satellite launches and rocket technology and all the things the Soviet Union were doing. At this point, we had never even sent a person into space. We didn't even know, really, if a person could survive in space. We had no idea how to get them to space. We had no idea how to get them to the moon. We didn't know anything about the moon. Some people thought that when you landed on the moon, you'd fall through feet of dust that had been sitting there and accumulating for literally hundreds of millions of years. So we had no fucking idea what was going on the moon. So phase 3 was not only the construction of everything that we needed to get up and over and down and build and stay and live, but remember that a lot of that had to just come out of people's asses because they were creating on the fly. Phase 3 is super fascinating. And phase 3 would last from 1961 to 1967. So note that phase 3 actually overlaps by 2 years the proposed launches which would begin in 1965, because that's when Phase 4 really begins. Phase 4 is the construction of the outpost, which technically begins actually in 1964. We start launching things to the moon. We start sending people there in 1965, 1966 in order to start building the outpost. And then by 1967, and really 1966 indeed, in parts of the report, they hope that people will stay there permanently. Phase 5 is the outpost enters actual use, actual operation in 1966. And then by Phase 6, 1968, they're going to actually start expanding the outpost. So not only are they talking about getting there and establishing the outpost and all of that, but that Phase 6 is the most ambitious indeed of them all, because they assume that since we spent all this time and money and material and research and manpower, we might as well make the moon base, the lunar base, way cooler and way bigger than it was. Of course, we never had the moon base. That's the whole disappointing part of this entire endeavor. The report notes by the end of 1964 that 72 Saturn I rockets were projected to have been launched by NASA and the military, and that 40 of those would be needed at the outset for Project Horizon. And ultimately, 61 Saturn I and 88 Saturn II rockets would be required for the entire project through November of 1966. So that's an extraordinary amount of launches. That is 5.3 launches per month in that period. That's way outpacing what NASA and the military ever had done. So again, keep that in mind, ambition. This is an ambitious and bold project. Through those 5.3 launches per month, 490,000 pounds of material would be brought to the moon, and then an additional 266,000 pounds would be brought through 64 more launches through the end of 1967. So they're going to be sending a ton of shit to the moon to make this happen. Again, bold and ambitious and totally unrealistic, but they didn't know any better. The 40 initial Saturn I and Saturn II launches would include 6 satellites, 8 lunar soft landings, 7 lunar circumnavigations, 4 orbital return missions, and 15 operational trips for the build-up phase, what they would call the build-up phase. And cargo would be sent to the lunar construction site directly from the Earth's surface in packages of 6,000 pounds each, or via orbit in packages of 48,000 pounds each. We're going to get into that in a minute, because there was a major discrepancy in Project Horizon about how they were going to do this, but I don't want to spoil that yet. So let's wait until we get to that point. The scary thing about this is that in the report, they admit that they don't expect that there is going to be an inconsequential failure rate. In fact, they predict that the failure rate will be 20%. So 1 in 5 rockets, no matter what it's containing, whether it's cargo, whether it's satellites, material, whether it's people, are going to explode or not get to the moon, and those people are going to die, or that material is going to be lost. And because of that, they actually want to keep 6 Saturn I and 10 Saturn II vehicles saved specifically for emergencies. Say they have to bring some emergency oxygen or water or whatever it might be. They are scared that the failure rate is going to accumulate into something that they're going to have to deal with. So they're going to have millions and really billions of dollars worth of vehicles and equipment that are just going to be left on the side in case they need to use them. An array of communication satellites that had not even been thought up or created yet were going to be needed for the lunar base, and they would be operational by 1964. Cargo delivery to the moon would begin in January of 1965. The first manned landing of the original 2 people that would begin building the base would begin in April of 1965. The first 12-man group to fully occupy the base would happen in November of 1966, and a world network of tracking and communication facilities would be in operation until 1967. So they had this plan. It was ambitious. 1959, the report's being made. People would be on the moon 6 years later if they had everything go according to plan. How much would it cost? Well, this is where things get a little bonkers, because Apollo, which was actually the real moon missions that happened a little bit later, were astronomically expensive. For the 8.5 years that they thought that this was going to originally run, Project Horizon would originally run, they thought it would cost $6 billion or $700 million a year. So again, this shows it's not ignorant because they're stupid, it just shows the ignorance of, like, they are looking at it through a military lens. They're not looking at it through a space travel lens, which is so expensive. So they way undershot that as well. They were so bullish, actually, that they projected that it would account for no more than 2% of the total military outlay for those years. So 1 in every $50 would be given to Project Horizon. Again, just not possible, but they didn't know that at the time. But they wanted to get costs down. Originally, they were looking to spend $4,250 per pound sent to the lunar base, including initial and active investments. And then to continue operations, pricing would need to come down. They admit that it would need to come down as the next phase after the first 8 years elapsed. And by 1968, they wanted to get it down to $1,850 per pound. And then, because again, this is such a pie-in-the-sky idea, and they were thinking and they were being ambitious and they were being excited, they thought that if they could get nuclear or electric propulsion units to bring these spacecraft up instead of using like raw liquid fuel, that they can get the cost down to $400 a pound by 1975, assuming that the lunar outpost was there, it was occupied, and it was still growing. And they also wanted to throw in like, hey, don't worry about this money that's going to cost. Think about all the money we spend on these other things. And they talk about the $10 billion per year they spend on aircraft and missiles and the $42 billion a year on the annual defense budget. So this was supposed to be a drop in the hat. Little did they know that something like this would have cost the entire defense budget, many times the entire defense budget over many years. But I digress. The next section that I kind of went through and looked around were like, what were the challenges? What were the specific challenges? We've talked about some of them already, the monetary challenges, the technological challenges, but there are real challenges that they had to deal with here. And one of them was that they just didn't understand anything about the moon. They didn't have good photography of the moon yet. At this point, we hadn't had any really great pictures of the moon. They could study the moon with some great Earth-based telescopes, but we didn't have any orbiting satellites around the moon. We didn't have anything really in space in orbit around the Earth looking at the moon. So they really had a lot to learn about the moon. They anticipate getting more data that they would need between December of 1960 and August of 1962. And the equatorial area on the light side of the moon was deemed pretty necessary. And they narrowed it down to like under a dozen or fewer than a dozen areas that they would land on. And then 3 of those areas were really the ones that they were aiming at, that looked clean, that spacecraft could land on, that they could kind of create a base and have little difficulty. But again, they just didn't know. They were also dealing with the idea that the moon has no atmosphere, that temperatures vary widely between like negative 200 degrees Fahrenheit and nearly 300 degrees Fahrenheit. So like 450 degrees, 500 degrees of difference that they had to really deal with. That was a scary proposition for them. And a 1/6 of the Earth's gravity. So they didn't know what was going to happen in the human body, how this was going to affect equipment. I mean, one of the great things is that we have leverage with bulldozers, for instance, here based on gravity and how heavy something is. But what if you send a 2-ton or 3-ton or 4-ton vehicle that was expected to push lunar dirt around, but it suddenly had 1/6 of the weight and therefore 1/6 of the power to push those things? They had to deal with this stuff. They had no idea how to deal with it. And they identify other areas that needed attention as well, and it was basically everything. Food, oxygen, clothing, chemical, biological, radiological, biomedical, vacuum conditions, weightlessness, meteoroids, lunar-based systems, moon mapping, explosives, power generation, material and lubricants, liquid hydrogen production and handling, and lunar soil mechanics. In other words, they had to study all of it. They needed smart minds working on all of these things individually for years at a time. And the military was open that they wouldn't only need NASA's help, but a lot of other organizations' help as well. They give a rundown actually in the report. It says that they would need the NSC, the CIA, the State Department, the FBI, the Department of Justice, the U.S. Coast Guard, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Department of the Interior, and the Atomic Energy Commission to get all of this done. So now they're pulling from all of these different services in order to get Project Horizon off the ground. Pardon the pun. Earlier, I mentioned that there was a philosophical question on something very fundamental to the operation. And that thing was, should they go from the Earth to the moon directly? Or should they go from the Earth to an orbital platform that had yet to be built or even dreamed up, and then launch from there? They would need more thrust from the Saturn I and Saturn II rockets to get less material off the ground and directly to the moon. They would need to use all the thrust to get less to the moon, but it would be easier. So they would have to launch more rockets with less on it in order to get things directly from the Earth to the moon. But if they endeavored to create an orbital platform, basically a space station, then they would use less thrust, get more into low Earth orbit, and then launch it with much less thrust to the moon and be able to get more down there with no problems at all. And this was a fundamental question that they dealt with. And the ironic thing is that even though the Earth to moon directly would have been more straightforward, that it simply wouldn't have been feasible to get everything we needed to get to the moon in a timely and cheap manner. So they realized, wow, not only do we have to endeavor to create this lunar base and create all this science and figure all of that out, we actually need to create a space station that is going to be a rendezvous point for all of these ships, these 5.3 launches per month on average, to get everything to the moon, to get people to the moon, material, information, all of that kind of stuff. So now they're creating a lunar base, and they're creating an orbital platform, a space station, and they're sending people into space, and they're dealing with all this science. Project Horizon is an unwieldy beast. Interestingly, that didn't abate them from being really ambitious with the orbital platform as well. In fact, they talk about, similar to the lunar platform, they're going to expand the orbital platform, that the orbital platform is going to be expanded over time and have a permanent crew of its own. And they were looking at launch sites as well, and they wanted equatorial launch sites. And they were identifying places like Somalia and other places around the world where these launches might have to take place, because the orbital platform will be orbiting around the Earth's equator. So instead of launching from the United States, say launching from Virginia or something, and then having to find its way up and over, they could just launch up and hopefully rendezvous in some way with it. And they actually identified 2 specific places that they thought would be best for this. One was Brazil, and the other was Christmas Island. And they thought that both of these areas would be opportune prime areas to launch Project Horizon's rockets from. Okay, so let's say that everything's going according to plan. We're now through the multiple phases at the beginning. This is going to happen. Project Horizon's going to happen. What is the base going to look like? How is this base going to work? How is it going to fit on the moon? What is it going to do? Well, there's a lot of information in these 2 volumes about Project Horizon that give us some information and illuminate the entire idea of where they were thinking and what they were thinking about how this would all work. Earlier, I mentioned that there's this amazing quote about the lack of realism, as it were, about this entire endeavor that the Department of Defense and the U.S. military was investigating. And this particular quote from the report says it all, and I love it. Here's what it says. Quote, "In designing a lunar installation, it is necessary to substitute needed realism for uncontrolled imagination. The lunar facility herein proposed is devoid of glamour and is intended to do only one job and do that job well. That job is to serve the men who must stake their lives on its functional adequacy and reliability. It is not realistic, however, to plan such an expedition and commit considerable resources solely on the hope that desirable but wholly unpredictable events will occur within a given period of time." End quote. It's a pretty amazing statement. So in April of 1965, as I mentioned earlier, the first 2 guys would land on the moon. And these guys actually would be able to immediately return to Earth if something happened based on their landing vehicle. It would have immediate return capabilities, but otherwise they'd be expected to live in this lander as they would go around and start collecting the cargo that had been dropped there by the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of pounds over time and start accumulating that and getting everything together. And since this report is obsessed with phases, this particular period would occur with 3 phases. The 2 of them would be there by themselves, and they would have to deal with these things in order, these 3 things. The first 30 to 90 days, it says, would be spent verifying presumed details about the orbital probes and satellites, specifically about a landing site. So what they're basically saying is we have these assumptions based on science that we've conducted from afar, from observations we've conducted from orbit. We've done some circumnavigations of the moon. We've sent some satellites. We've sent some probes. We've landed some landers. Is everything that we've deemed true? Or is that what you're seeing with your own 2 eyes? We think X, Y, and Z is true. Is it true? And specifically, is the landing site that we've identified suitable to build this base? They'll answer that over the first 1, 2, 3 months that they're there. The next 18 months after that, people will begin coming to the moon more for construction purposes that have specialties in construction and engineering, and no one will be there for longer than a calendar year, ideally. And we'll get into the specialties a little bit later when we talk about the actual people that are manning the base, but this is what they're concerned about right now. Let's build this thing. We have 18 months. Let's get this thing built so that we can start living off of the ships that we've landed in and start expanding the living space so they have a little more room to live and breathe, quite literally and quite figuratively, and hopefully have some recreation as well, etc. and so on. So they're going to start building the base. And at this point, following those 18 months, 12 men, which is what the original base is designed to accommodate when it's operational, will be able to start living there. And 6 of them will always be dedicated to the operation and maintenance of the base at all times. They're not there to do anything else but to maintain and operate the base. And the other 6 will be there to conduct science experiments, to conduct all sorts of military experiments, whatever the case might be. So they're split half and half. The base itself, as they envision it, are these master cylindrical metal tanks that are 10 feet in diameter and 20 feet in length. And they would be dug under the moon, under several feet of lunar soil, if not more, to protect them from radiation, to protect them from temperature changes. And one of the things actually that they talk about regularly in this report that they were afraid of, that I think NASA has become less afraid of over the decades, are meteoroid impacts. To this day, no one doing spacewalks or that landed on the moon had to deal with meteoroids, but they thought they were way more common at this time, and they wanted to kind of strip away that risk. And we'll get into a minute the spacesuit and how that was supposed to deal with meteoroids as well. And they also were obsessed with reusing things, so cargo vessels, fuel tanks, all these things that couldn't be really used again once they arrived to the moon would be used for storage and incorporated in other ways into the base, because obviously when you're on the moon, you only have what you brought there and what is there, and there's nothing there to use, and so you really need to be smart and judicious with everything you have. And they have a few rules. Quote, methods must be developed to work the lunar material without excess expenditure of energy. Communications with Earth must be possible at all times. Full visibility of the outpost from Earth would be desirable from a safety viewpoint, end quote. They note, as I said earlier, that they're going to have to rework these machines because they're not going to have the leverage that they have on Earth to move things, to destroy things. They can't really use explosives that safely because with 1/6 of the Earth's gravity, these things are going to be fucking flying apart, these exploding rocks or whatever. They're afraid of that. So they're starting to learn and deal with these hypothetical problems that actually aren't so hypothetical once you're on the moon. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a massive temperature problem there because there's no atmosphere to diffuse temperatures. What the sun is hitting is going to be hundreds of degrees hotter than something that's in the shade, even if they're right next to each other. So they had to deal with, like, well, how can our equipment survive these massive changes and these sustained changes that would take days and days of sunlight or days and days of no sunlight and shade and shadow? How would our transmission cables, how would our spaceships and all these, our spacesuits, all this deal with these massive extremes? They had to deal with that as well. And they also had a very rudimentary understanding of the radiation and all this that was going to be constantly bombarding the astronauts on the surface, which is why they wanted them underground to begin with. But how would these cargo tanks really work, these aforementioned cargo tanks? Here's what it says, quote, 3 cargo-sized tanks prefabricated as living quarters will be buried with at least 3 feet of lunar material coverage in a man-made trench. The excavation and backfill will be accomplished with a multi-purpose construction vehicle. These quarters will consist of 1 airlock tank and 2 tanks for sleeping, dining, and general living quarters, end quote. So it wouldn't be one of these cylinders, but 3 of them kind of hatched together, and you can see the pictures that I'll put over a lot of this so you can see what they were thinking, because yes, there are tons of graphs and tons of pictures and schematics that give a little bit of an idea of what they're talking about. This is one of my favorite parts about this, though, is how they were going to get power. Remember that they thought that 1 in 5 of these rockets going to the moon were going to explode, and that they were going to lose things. Now imagine one of those rockets holding nuclear material, because that's what they were going to send to the moon. Nuclear reactors. Here's what it says, quote, the basic power supply for use immediately after landing and during the preparation of the advanced party construction camp will be a 5 kilowatt nuclear reactor. The nuclear power plants which are to be assembled to provide power for construction of the outpost facilities are rated at 10 kilowatts and 40 kilowatts. After selection of the outpost site, craters are to be blasted for the power plants. To provide radiation shielding, lunar material not less than 12 feet in thickness is required, end quote. And they go on to say, quote, nuclear reactors were selected as the basic power sources, since no other source can compete on a pound per kilowatt hour basis. Solar devices might be competitive except for the 14-day lunar night and the difficulty of storing energy in either form as heat or as electricity, end quote. There's one thing here that's interesting. That's still true. Nothing can compete with nuclear power, and we shouldn't be so scared of it. But I digress. These nuclear power plants, these small nuclear power plants, as they said, would have to be buried and segregated from the living quarters, and they need to be buried under tons of rock and dirt, and they're afraid that things might happen to them as well, and they write a little bit about that, about how they're going to have to sometimes excavate them, that people are going to be exposed to this radiation, but that they have no real choice, that this is really the most efficient way to power the lunar base. To help with all of the work, they also had this idea of this kind of do-it-all bulldozer ground vehicle thing that I'll show pictures of here that would be able to accomplish all sorts of tasks for them. And here's how they describe it, quote, the multi-purpose construction vehicle is capable of performing general construction work to include the moving of lunar material, excavation of subsurface trenches, heavy cargo handling, prime mover functions, and other mechanical work which man alone in a lunar suit cannot perform. The vehicle will be approximately 15 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 6 feet high. It will be capable of being operated remotely by control transmission cables or radio. A removable pressurized cab will be provided for the operator so he may work without a full lunar suit, end quote. And once these vehicles are used to create these tanks, well, the tanks are going to really allow people to live and survive in ways that are not ideal and certainly not luxurious by any stretch of the imagination. But the titanium that they're going to coat them with will allow them to live without their suits on, and they can have recreational areas, like I said earlier, kitchen, all sorts of things, so they can live somewhat of a normal, restful life when they're not out on the harsh lunar surface. But not only is this base made for human capacity as well, it's also made for animals. And they talk specifically about creatures like guinea pigs and how they can experiment on them there in labs. And again, it's ambitious. All right, so the final section that I want to cover is about the people, the actual men, and they would be men only, that would be going to this base. And who are they, and what would they do there, and what would it be like for them there? Well, this is what this section's all about. The people that they're looking for are, not surprisingly, very smart, very put together, and very strong. They say, quote, Project Horizon presents unique requirements in matters of personnel and administration just as much as it does in the technical aspects of research, development, or operations. Among them are novel skills and backgrounds, broad requirements for additional acquired qualifications or capabilities, end quote. That last sentence is actually really important to them because they want people that not only know something very well, an engineer, a physicist, whatever, but that's someone that not only has a full grasp of their field, but that can learn other fields as well very quickly. Quote, the academic requirements for both the orbital and the lunar groups include a university degree and the specialty or primary skill involved. Several years of practical experience at a reasonable technical level are also required in that field, end quote. And they later say, quote, each selectee must be medically sound, alert, and intelligent, with demonstrated physical stamina and emotional stability. No mental maladjustment or physical malformation capable of producing a functional handicap is tolerable, end quote. And they talk about how the two men that first go in 1965 to begin building should be most familiar with construction, engineering, and medicine, but that eventually more people will come behind them that will be mostly construction and engineering focused, and then they can start to diversify. Because remember I told you that once the base is permanent, they'll split them up into 6 and 6, and the 6 of them will be more engineering based and construction based and maintenance based, and the other 6 will be specialties that can finally start doing the hard work that hopefully the lunar base would allow them to do. Remember that the orbital platform that I mentioned earlier is also going to need a crew, and they looked at the crew somewhat like this. They would need 2 vehicle controllers, 1 medical doctor, 3 mechanical engineers, 2 electrical engineers, a communications engineer, and a rocket engineer at all times, and that they would hopefully have 4 of these groups constantly in rotation so that none of them would stay in space for that long, some of them can have rest and relaxation down on Earth, and more of them can be training for their next time up in space. Meanwhile, on the lunar base, they wanted the setup to be more like this. A doctor, a general engineer, 2 mechanical engineers, 2 construction engineers, 2 electrical engineers, an astrophysicist, a communications engineer, a project officer, a chemophysicist, an astronomer, and a biologist. So, pretty different skill sets, but very smart, educated, scholarly, know-how driven people were going to be on this lunar base. This wasn't going to be like, say, Armageddon. And they talk about the ideal candidate, which again is going to be a man. They talk about how the man cannot be more than 6 feet tall or 185 pounds. So actually, I'm 6 feet tall and 185 pounds. I just am not a geophysicist, and I'm also somewhat fat. So I don't think I'd be a good candidate for it. But someone 6 feet tall or under, 185 pounds or less, is what they were looking for. They talk about how their marital status isn't that important to them. They talk about how they're looking for people that actually don't judge others and have an open mind about belief structures, like religious structures, which is pretty interesting. And that the person must be between 21 years old and 45 years old, period. In addition to them all having their skill, the chemist knows chemistry, the physicist knows physics, etc., they'll all have a little bit of a dabble in someone else's field in case there's a redundancy needed or some help needed. And they'll all be familiar with like survival skills, cooking, maintenance of the base, all that kind of stuff as well. Their spacesuits were these monstrosities that actually looked like they were actually going to be on like these snowshoe-like devices. They were going to be coated in metal because, again, they were afraid of meteoroids, and they were going to be massively heavy. But remember, on the moon, they would be 1/6 as heavy. So they were saying that even though there would be some encumbrance problems, they wouldn't be able to move and jump around, and really, they'd have more flexibility and more movement than you might think. A 300-pound suit would only weigh 50 pounds on the surface of the moon, so they weren't super worried about any of that. Each suit would have a 6-month life cycle. Each person on the moon would have 2 full suits in excess in case something happened to their suit, and they'd have another 100 pounds of extra equipment to fix suits that were broken or torn or somehow incapacitated. Each person would be allotted 3 quarts of water and 4 pounds of food per day. And remember that this was a time when they didn't understand, and they talk pretty openly about this, about how they don't have any idea how they can reuse water. They talk about how if you shower, they can probably use that water in a different way as coolant and all that kind of stuff, but they didn't know how to process urine yet. They didn't know how any of that worked. So a lot of the materials that were coming, the cargo that was coming to the moon was actually not only pre-cooked food, but water. But what's so interesting is that they talk about, could we get them fresh vegetables? Could they use hydroponic technology to create fresh vegetables? They talk about the psychological effect that might have, the positive psychological effect that might have on the astronauts up there. They also talk about how, could they rear chickens? Could chickens live on the moon with them and give them meat and give them eggs? They talk about having fish. They talk about these massive aquariums that they can have fish, about how they might be able to harvest algae to make some interesting food and some interesting pastes that would be very nutritious and very beneficial to the astronauts. I mean, this is some pretty wild stuff, right? And that's what I love about this Project Horizon so much and why I found it so fascinating. What's funny is that what got me so interested in reading about Project Horizon at first is, as far as I can tell, not true. You might notice in the Wikipedia article and then on other articles about Project Horizon that they talk about these defense systems that the moon base would have, and I was so fascinated by them. They talked about how they would have low-yield nuclear bombs and these mines that would be used to puncture spacesuits, Soviet spacesuits, if the Soviets, say, overland and invaded the base. But it's not anywhere in Project Horizon Volume 1 or Project Horizon Volume 2. I can't find anything about that. And in fact, in the talk section on the Wikipedia article, someone notes there that this isn't, no one knows where this came from. So as far as I can tell, the most interesting facet of it, which was the defense of the base, is actually not true, or it's from a source that I can't find. so I don't want to include that in the video, but I did want to let you know that that's floating around. Nonetheless, that's kind of a high-end view of Project Horizon, and I really hope you enjoyed it. I was sucked in reading about it and really kind of fascinated and smitten with it. It's so interesting to read about the what-ifs and the could-bes and all of this kind of thing that was happening at a much more innocent time in American history, when it was all about defeating the Soviet Union, the Cold War, besting your opponent, the propaganda value, the scientific value, the military value of all of these things. But moreover, this idea that they really didn't understand what they didn't understand, but that yet they bullishly pushed forward. And reading about this gave me hope that we can overcome some of these challenges in space travel that we've encountered, specifically with Mars, in saying, like, yes, some of the problems might be really hard to surmount and we don't really understand a lot of these issues. Some people might die. Some things might not go according to plan, but that we should do them anyway. And obviously Project Horizon isn't an example of that happening much further past the planning stage. They never commissioned any more reports. That was basically the beginning and the end of it. But nonetheless, I thought it was interesting. I wanted to tell you a little bit about it, and I really hope you take the time to read about it yourself. Just go into those reports and just jump around. It's so interesting. Well, that's it for this episode of Colin's Last Stand. Thank you so much for your support. I hope you subscribe here on YouTube. Share the video with your friends and family. Please support me on Patreon if you like what I do. $1, $5, $10 a month really goes a long way to making this dream a reality, and I hope the content's getting better. We're buying more equipment. You might notice I have new lights here shining on me. I don't know if they're working very well or not. We'll find out. I'll let you be the judge of that. But nonetheless, your support on Patreon, while not a prerequisite to be a valued member of this community, is nonetheless very important to the sustenance of this community and sustaining this idea that we can do ad-free, independent, historical, and political content. So be good to each other in the comments. You'll find me down there as well. Bibliography, as always, in the description. And give a thumb up if you liked the video, and a thumb down if you didn't. I'll find you on Reddit at our Colin's Last Stand community there. We're on Facebook at the official group and the unofficial group. You'll find me on Twitter, Patreon, like I said, etc. and so on. I'll see you next time for Colin's Last Stand. Thank you so much for your support. Keep on learning.